In this video, we're going to take a look at how to control fluids within the X Particles domain object. We're going to have them follow a spline and then form a logo. This is the end result. So you can see the particles and the fluids are following around the spline object, and then they're branching out being a fluid, and then they form the logo. Now generally fluids inside the domain are quite difficult to control with the modifiers, but we're going to show you how to do that in an easy way. So let's get started. As you can see, we've got our logo pre-made. We're going to get a X particle system. We're going to create a emitter. And we're also going to go to dynamics and we're going to create a flip domain. Okay, let's look at the flip domain to start with. We're going to keep it as a liquid type and we're going to keep weak spring on. We'll put the vorticity up to about 200%, and you can play with this depending on what sort of motion you want inside the fluids. And we're going to change the voxels down to about 10 centimeters. This will just give us a little bit more detail. The lower you go, the more detail you'll get. We're going to go down to the solver and change the retiming to about 60 or 70%. Let's try 60 to start with. And we're going to change the accuracy from the default to the fast mode. So just enable fast, and that's just going to solve a little bit quicker. Everything else we can leave as it is. Now we're going to add a spline object. So we're going to go to our spline objects, create a circle, because we're going to have them flowing around a circle, and you can do other shapes as well. Let's just drop our circle into the generators list, other objects list, and change it down to about 110 centimeters or 120. Okay, now if I just hide our logo because we don't need to see that. Generally, if you use something like a follow spline, it won't work very well because it can't get enough velocity inside the domain. Let's have a look at how it's going to work. I'm going to set our emitter to positive Y and move it across. Let's just scale it down a little bit. And we'll get a follow spline modifier. So go to motion modifiers, follow spline, and use the circle spline. If we push play, you'll see the particles will try and do it, but they're not going to really stick to the surface, and they generally won't even make it all the way around. Let's just give ourselves more time on the timeline. Let's go to 25 seconds. They'll struggle to stick to the spline, and the domain will have more influence over it. And there's not a lot you can do because modifiers like this don't have a strength option. So the way around that is we'll delete that modifier, go back, and I'm going to build a sweep node. So I'm going to choose an N side, make this about 50 centimeters, maybe even smaller. Let's try 30. Here, and then we'll get a sweep. Create ourselves a shape inside the domain. So let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's try 40. And we don't need the fong because you can see it's just messing it all up. So just either delete the tag or set it down to about 20%. I'm going to put a display tag on this. So Cinema 4D tags display. Use wires with lines and set that to isopalms. So we can see our shape, and let's go into our emitter. We want the particles to be really dense, and a good way to do that is to create a really small opening in the emitter so that the particles come out with more density. Okay, and just move this slightly to the side. Now at the moment they're still not going to do anything, they're just going to flow up, hit the boundary and just be like a fluid. We want them to go inside that, and we're going to use the avoid modifier to do so. I'm just going to quickly change the display mode on our particles. display, go down, change that to gradient parameter, change that to speed, and enable auto. Next thing, go to modifiers, and we want to choose a void modifier. So select a void and drop the sweetener into the objects linked list. Now if we push play, you can see our particles are flowing inside of the spline that we created, and they're still being affected by the domain. So it's still a fluid, and you can see that because they were interacting with each other. And also if we go to our domain, put more vorticity in there, you'll see over time they start to get more and more speed and more vorticity. So you can see they're starting to flow around. Now if you've got a higher vorticity setting, they're going to get faster and faster and faster, and then in the end they'll start leaking out of the shot. So we're going to set that back to 200%, and we're going to add a turbulence modifier instead, just to help get some turbulence going on inside there. So we'll set that to 20%, and strength to something like 15 to 25. Let's try 25 to start with. If it's too much, we can dial that down. So it's not too bad. It might be a bit too much though, so let's go for 15. And we'll put in more particles, so let's go set that to about 5,000. Okay, so that's looking nice. It's going to hit there, boil around and get some nice looking vorticity. Now, at some point we're going to have these particles start forming the logo, which means we're going to want this to not be inside of the void, so we're going to have to turn that off, and we're also going to stop the emissions. So let's say we stop our emissions at 200 frames, which is 6.667 seconds. So we're going to copy that and go to our emitter, emissions, and turn the emit all frames switch off, and end the emission at 6.66 seconds. So they're going to stop emitting at that time. Okay, so let's get 200, no more particles are going to be emitted, and that's when we want them to start to be pulled into the logo. Now, the particles that are affected by the domain will also not fill a logo, because the cover target can't compete with the velocities inside the domain. So we're going to use a separate system on top of that one to create the logo. But we still want them to do the same thing. We still want them to pull in so it looks like they're doing what we want them to. So let's start working on that. So we need a cover target modifier, and the target object is our logo. I'm going to change the particle speed to reach the time within 2 seconds. You could put some variation in there as you want, but you'll get that anyway. Now if we look at default, it can't do it because of the void modifier that can't get past. So we need to turn these things on and off over time. So let's go to our emitter and let's label this main fluid, and we'll go to the questions and we'll add a question, and the first one is going to be set to turn everything on or off. So we're going to call this main fluid start, and we're going to set the time as greater than 0 seconds. Now within this, we're not going to create any actions. We're going to use the activate and deactivate section. So at the start, we don't want the cover activated, so we're going to set that to deactivate. But we do want the turbulence, and we do want the void modifier. So that'll play exactly how we expect it, how we had it set up originally. Okay, so then we can create another question, and we'll go in there, create a question, and we'll call this one main fluid logo. And this one is going to happen at that time frame that we turn the particles off, so 6.667 seconds. And then we're going to change what happens in here. So we're going to activate cover target, and we're going to deactivate avoid and turbulence. Okay, so let's push play. So we're going to flow around until the timeline hits 200. And at which point it's going to stop emitting, and then they're going to start being pulled in. And you can see it's being pulled in, but they're not going to form the logo very well because obviously they're still being affected by the domain, which is fine. It helps sell the shot because you've got all these particles that are boiling around and being a fluid, but we want them to start disappearing by about 10 seconds. So we'll go to our emitter, and we'll go to emissions, and with the full lifespan we're going to turn that off and set the lifespan to 10 seconds with a 1 second variation, which means they'll start popping off over time. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get a skinner on this. So let's just find a nice part of the shot so we can work on the skinner. So we'll look at about here. Let's go to generators, and we will enable the skinner object. Drop our emitter into the source link, and we're going to change the ISO surface to Zubridson. We're going to get a polygon size of 5, and that will still work pretty quickly within the viewport. As you can see, it's a bit of a slowdown, but it's not too bad. And then we will just enable the smoothing on geometry just to smooth it down. And let's hide our emitter particles. So that's working well. And then what we want to do is we want to cache this. So we're going to go to other objects, and we're going to use the cache object and build the cache for this system. Now we can probably change our time frame down to about 20 seconds, maybe even less. Let's cache this. So that's good. Happy with how that's starting to look. So what we can do now is we can start getting the secondary system, and if you look at the video you can see that there's more particles that are coming out here and creating the sort of secondary fluid motion off of the top. That's what we're going to create now. So we're going to create a new emitter, and we'll call this guy Secondaries. We're going to change the emitter shape to object, and we're going to emit from the skinner object. So let's label that skinner main. Then we're going to change it to polygon area. And let's get another, let's try 3000 particles. Again, we're going to change the display, squares, gradient parameter, and speed. Set that to auto. Okay. So if we push play now, these particles that we're newly creating on the surface are going to be using all of these modifiers, and we don't want that. We want them to use the cover, but not yet. So we're going to go to our secondaries, we're going to go to the modifiers, and we're going to exclude avoid, and we're going to exclude turbulence, and let's just label these up. So with turbulence main, avoid is main as well, cover is for all, so we can just call that all. And while we're testing, I'm going to drop the cover one in there as well, but I'm going to pull that out later. So now our particles will be still affected by the domain, so let's get them out of the domain as well. Just drop the domain into the exclusion list, and you can see just creating particles spawning off the surface. Let's go to our emissions and change our speed down to about 3, and we can put some variation in there, and that'll just slow it down, keep them a bit tighter. And then we want to put our own turbulence in there, so we're going to go in and add another turbulence modifier, and we'll call this Secondaries. We can change this one to a curl noise, drop the frequency down and the strength to about 2%. Okay, so that's just flowing off the surface, and that's exactly what we want it to be doing. We might want a few more particles, and I'm also going to go in to our emitter and change the object change to connect object. Sometimes it helps with the distribution of the particles when they're emitting. Let's get a few more particles, let's say 5,000. Okay. So now we want our particles to stop emitting at the same frame. So we'll go in and we'll change the emit from. Paste that, keep those time limit in there, the 6.667. And now those particles will stop emitting at the same frame as our previous ones. The next thing we want them to do is to use the cover target. So let's go back into our modifiers and bring this one out, so just delete it from the list. But we'll need to trigger that with an question as we have previously. So questions, add a question, and we're going to have to use 2 questions. So again, we'll call this S1. So Secondaries 1, and from 0 seconds we want to have the cover target deactivated, our turbulence activated, and then a second question, and we'll call this S2, so Secondaries 2. Get our time in there, 6.667, and we want to activate our cover and deactivate the turbulence. And I'm just going to make sure we've got the right thing, so cover all, turbulence, yep. Okay, so let's push play. So stop emitting, and then they're going to start pulling in and forming the logo underneath the previous fluid. Like so. Okay, that's good. Now we can skin that, and again we use the same skinner setup as we had previously, but we might need to tweak it a little bit just to get a tighter logo. So we get a skinner, drop in our secondaries, and surface mode, Turbulence, polygon size 5, and geometry smooth. You can see it's not quite making the logo, so we're going to pull our surface level down. Let's see what 50 does. Okay, let's hide our particles. Let's pull it down until we get the logo. That's too much. Let's get the smaller polys. So let's try 4x4. Just gotta just tweak this until you get the logo forming as you want. That's not going to work. Let's try a custom radius of 5. Okay, bring that back up. Okay, there we go. That's looking good. So let's push play. So you can see on top of it you've got these new particles, and they're still a bit too tight, so I'm going to put that to 5 again. and then they'll pull in and create the logo. So you can tweak these around just to get the sort of the look you're after. Don't have to use Zubrids, and you can use a different type. See what works for the shot. See how that forms. But we'll leave it back what it was anyway, so we can continue. Next thing we're going to do is we need to cache this one. So we go back to our cache object, and we'll use build cache, but instead of overwrite, we're going to use continue. That means it's going to continue from what's already cached. So if I hit continue, you'll see that the pre-cached stuff is already left as red, and then it's caching the new ones. Okay, so with that done, you can see we've got the particles flying around, and then in the end forming the logo. And the last piece of the puzzle is regarding the particles is to create this final batch of just small particles which will help sell the fluid. So we can do that by emitting particles on top of the mesh surface. Now the meshes as currently are two separate systems. So what we're going to do is going to go to our cinema menu and use the connect object, and the connect object will connect these two meshes into a single object, and we can emit from that. We don't need anything to weld. So we call this mesh, and we create final emitter. So new emitter, call this one dots, change our display to white, and we're going to emit from object, and we'll use our connect object, polygon area, make sure it connects on, just to make sure it all connects up. Emission, let's change that to 5,000 again. We can up that or lower that depending on what you need. Slow emissions, and a life of about 2 seconds, and let's put a 1 second variation in there, and we'll keep these ones emitting until about 10 seconds. Okay, that should all be fine. Now we need to make sure it's not talking to any of these, so modifiers, and we'll drop all these guys in. So it's just going to emit from the surface, and we want it to keep inside the domain as well, so it gets some of the sort of fluid motion from the domain, but we'll give it its own little turbulence as well, and just sort of drop that down, something like 85, in the scale and frequency, and a strength of about 6. So there's just a little bit of life on top of the system just to help it be more, coherent as a single fluid. And again, you can cache that, but we'll leave that. So when it comes to rendering this thing, what we did was just a simple background as a reflection map, and that's about it, one light on top. So we can close this, we'll get an area light, and with the details we're going to make sure it's shown by reflection. So we lift this up, and rotate it down so it's pointing at the fluid. Let's make it quite wide. So then we'll create a background, so new material, turn off reflectance, and we'll change that to a gradient, a circle gradient, invert the knots, and just put really dark blue colour in there. So that'll go onto a background object. So get the framing. so you can render that. You'll just see the shape. Oh, we're getting that initial sweep, so we can hide that completely. Okay, like so. And then we're going to put some fluid into this. Well, let's get a background as well, so we'll go and add a sky object, and we'll put a compositing tag to just be seen by rays, so don't want to cast shadows, don't want the camera to see it. Then we'll put a HDR on there, the reflectance, so onto the sky object, so it's got something to reflect. And then we'll create a new material, and we'll set the color to a dark. Go into transparency, let's just get a bit of blue in there. Enable transparency, and again we'll put some blue into it as well, so a little bit. Change the refraction to 1.33, a little bit glassy thing, like so. Slight bit of absorption colour as well. Okay, and we'll enable reflections. The GGX is fine. Put a bit of roughness in it, and then drop that onto our mesh. So if we hit render, it's going to take a while, and there is a quick way to fix that speed, which will change the fluid look, but not overly drastically. We'll go into our render settings, options, and we've got this thing called ray depth, and if we drop that down, let's say it's 15 now, and you saw the speed it took to render. If we drop that to 1, you can see how quickly it renders, but there's nothing going through. So you slowly rise the ray depth, you'll see it's quick to render, but you'll start seeing the look. So rise it up until you find a happy medium where it renders quickly and you still get a liquid looking render. So I find 5 works quite well. It's a bit slower, but you're getting a nice liquid look. And we'll also use physical as well, because it's going to render that a bit quicker. So we'll set render and go automatic, and we'll leave it at 20% threshold. Okay, so it's not too bad. You could go down a lower ray depth, but 5 looks quite good, so I'm going to leave it at that. And then just want to render the particles as well, so we go to our shader, next particles material, drop that on the emitted dots, and we'll just go in and change the size down, a bit of variation and some age into it. Okay, so let's just render that. Too small, let's make that a bit bigger. And what we did when we did the final was we rendered these as a separate pass using the mesh as a matte object and then compositing them on top, so you can see they're on top as well as going behind. And then we just use a simple glow in After Effects to get the final